All right, welcome back, everyone. I am super excited to introduce Mia this morning. Mia is a fellow in neuroscience and society at the Dana Foundation, specifically working on the Dana Frontiers program, where she is focused on multi-directional community engagement in neuroscience. So super exciting work there. And her background is focused on applications of science and neuroscience and AI in the context of punishment, sentencing, and criminal justice policy. She holds a PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the Netherlands, as well as a bachelor's degree in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Westminster in London, and two master's degrees in neuropsychology and in criminal justice, respectively. So, without further ado, I will pass the mic over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremiah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this lecture. Yeah, I'm very excited to be participating in NeuroNovember. I hope everyone's enjoying the program so far. Some brilliant talks lined up this year, so that's really cool. Yeah, excited to be here. My talk today is about how physical principles of causality and, of course, how they relate to brain biology and behavior, how they're relevant to criminal justice and to more generally our intuitions about blame and punishment and sort of how we deal with behavior in society. Um, so if you basically have no idea at this point what that means, you're not alone. I'm hoping that with a mixed audience like this, by the end of my talk, most of you would have gotten sort of a first taste, like a first contact with the ideas around this type of thinking, around deterministic thinking, and the idea that causal physical relationships, cause and effect types of relationships are relevant to our understandings of judgment and of the way the criminal justice system judges behavior. So some of what I'll talk about will seem very self-explanatory. Cause and effect relationships we all learned in high school, and they are kind of intuitive. Some of it may be counterintuitive. And for this reason, not everything sort of will be clear to you today. And a lot of this has taken years for me, noodling with it until I was able to really put it into context. So don't worry if that happens to you. My goal is that the next time you encounter these types of ideas, you'll be prepared to think about them and sort of understand them more. All right. So first, I'll briefly introduce myself, and then I'll show you sort of how the laws of physics are relevant to criminal justice. So I will get into some basic physics, very basic. Don't be alarmed by this. There's no maths involved, and we'll only scratch the surface. A lot of this may feel like revisiting sort of very few and basic things from high school physics. I hope that you'll find that remembering these basic ideas about causality will sort of illuminate your understanding of criminal justice and what we hope to achieve through these systems, and that you'll understand how these things are related. So after explaining or more likely reminding you of these basic laws of physics, I'll transition into how these rules govern biology and behavior and what that means for our notions of blame and responsibility. And then finally, I'll sort of return to the relationships of physical causality and criminal justice, and I'll talk about where specifically punishment and sentencing fits into all of this. Right. So yeah, so my name is Mia. My academic background, as already described today, is in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience. More recently, I found myself at this intersection of neuroscience and criminal justice. So neuroscience and the ways it's used in society or not used in many cases. And all that I've learned from studying and researching these topics in more basic neuroscience in a way sort of propelled me to care about and to want to understand and explain how our societal rules and sort of the moral rules that are baked into our systems of justice are dealing basically with human behavior and where that information that we use to do that comes from. So yeah, I'm generally interested in what we expect and how we respond and where inaccuracies and sort of contradictions exist in this relationship between neuroscience and law. And I'm also very interested in data science and analytics, and that just ties into me being interested in sort of facts and truths, and often these can be very inconvenient truths, as you'll see today. As I said previously as well, some things are counterintuitive, which makes them hard to understand, but nonetheless true, let's say. All right, so jumping into the topic for today, why basically is science even relevant to law? I want to start by explaining sort of why our criminal justice policies need to listen to what we know about the laws of physics or the laws that govern brain biology. And in many cases, the two may seem far removed. Often we think about science and justice, law, society as two very, very different things that maybe shouldn't intersect. And my talk today is about how they aren't so different. So the way laws in much of Europe and in the US, of course, and in many other free societies define legal responsibility, which is at the core of how we think about law and justice. These laws directly incorporate the idea of mental states and intention and reason, right? So because of this, they are sort of inherently related. So in the US, for someone to be found guilty, it needs to be proven that they broke the law, of course. So in other words, that they committed a criminal act, right? That there's a law that requires an act to be broken, and they did that, which again, very intuitive. There needs to be a murder committed to be convicted of murder. But then there's a second step, and these are the two main pillars of guilt determination. The second step is it needs to be shown that they committed this act in a particular state of mind, and that they committed the act either intentionally or knowingly or recklessly or negligently. So those four states of mind are what determines guilt when a particular guilty act has been committed. So the first one, acting purposely, means that the defendant acted consciously with sort of an objective to do harm, right? It's what we think about when we think about a murder, where somebody has planned it and they knew what they were doing and they intentionally went out and killed somebody. So that's the worst one, basically. The second one, acting knowingly, means that being basically practically certain that a particular act will cause a certain result, but doing it anyway. So not setting out to commit the act, but doing something else. And in the process, you knew that, this other person would get killed and you did it anyway. So second worst. The third state of mind is acting recklessly. And that means that a person consciously disregarded serious risk. Here we're getting into more nuanced things. You don't have to fully understand what that means and what that means compared to negligent. But basically that there was a harm, and in the process of doing something else, the harm was kind of sort of recklessly disregarded. And then the final one, negligence, has to do more with specialized knowledge. So not everybody can be found negligent, more people who have specialized knowledge. So you can think of doctors that we hold to a certain standard that they should have been aware of a risk. Even if a regular person wouldn't have been, they should have been aware of the risk because of their training. So very nuanced things when you get into sort of reckless and negligent, but just to say that we have very specific definitions about the states of mind that we consider to be guilty. So we see this assumption here that a reasonable person engaged in a bad act when they could have chosen not to do so, whether because they knew the harm would occur or because they could have just not set out to kill. But there's this assumption of reasonableness, and we think that they should have known better and they should have done otherwise. So already you see that in this very, very basic understanding of legal responsibility and guilt determination, baked in, we have ideas about the way the mind functions. So basically brain biology is sort of at the core of our understanding of what makes for a guilty mind. So in the sentencing stage, when we think about that sort of in context, what happens next is that basically the law, based on common understandings on brain biology, defines some mitigating factors. So, for example, being very young or having a severe mental disorder, sometimes what they call crimes of passion, right? That you're in a specific state of mind while you commit that crime, sort of more acutely, can be seen as restricting that assumed reasonableness. So we think about states of mind and we think about the way that we plan things, right? This is all cognitive functions. And then as a secondary step in sentencing, we also think about other things that may have affected our behavior that are beyond our control, whether it's being a teenager and having that type of brain that teenagers have, which restricts their planning and cognitive abilities, or whether it's having a mental disorder or being in the heat of the moment feeling threatened, all these things. So the law takes all of this into account, and all of it basically refers to brain biology as the point of this slide. So hopefully you see that our knowledge of biology and behavior is very central to our legal understandings around criminal acts. So indeed, what we see when researchers ask the public, we find that most people have this understanding that their own moral compass, that when individuals, for whatever reason, are seen as having a diminished control over their actions, are seen as less blameworthy and they shouldn't be punished as harshly or retributively. So maybe punishment in those cases would be more for rehabilitation or even just to have the person restricted from harming others. So in other words, when we see people as not having complete control, complete freedom of will or freedom of choice because of their underlying biology, we are less retributive and we focus more on bringing about positive change. In fact, professional judges that preside over criminal cases and understand the law basically think the same. But what we find in our research, and is relevant to today's discussion, is that those judges that in their own beliefs in themselves do not believe in free will, but they believe that actions are caused and determined by underlying biological factors, these judges are less punitive overall. So independent of specific circumstances that we may present to them, a person having a mental disorder versus not, or a person being an adult versus a very young person or a child, judges seem to generally be guided by their own understanding of what drives behavior. Some judges may think that people have full freedom of will to choose their behaviors, to do otherwise, to choose to do the right thing. Those judges generally seem to be more punitive, more retributive. Those judges that believe that behavior is to some extent beyond our control because it's determined by prior factors and by our biology and our experiences are generally much less punitive, and they don't support retribution because they cannot place blame upon individuals that they see as acting based on a biology that they have not freely chosen. This is what we've seen in our sort of research when we're asking judges how they go about judging behavior more broadly. So what do we mean then by saying that behavior is the result of biology, right, or is caused by biology? So that's where we're going into a little bit of physics, just because the brain is a biological system. It's a physical system in the world, and so it's governed by laws of physics. So physical causality is the relationship between a cause and an effect, a cause and an outcome. Again, this is basic high school biology and something that most of us, I think of as a more intuitive thing, right? One thing causes the next thing, causes the next thing, and so on. So causality as a principle governs many physical systems. I suppose you could say not all of them, but I'll avoid sort of getting into, Einstein's theory of relativity for the purposes of today. So I'll talk about causality sort of and determinism from a more macroscopic viewpoint. So from a distance, ignoring what happens at the very microscopic level where some exceptions come in. So from this macro perspective, biological systems are generally considered to be deterministic. So the way the human brain is formed and then goes on to function is considered to be mostly deterministic, sometimes probabilistic, which has to do with our ability to predict outcomes, but always adheres to the rule that any outcome is caused by a prior event or state. So what we know is that causes determine effects, and that's true again in many physical systems, but it's true also for the human brain. And in the human brain, causes can be genes forming neurons, and then down the chain they can be pre-existing, let's say, experiences and behavioral outcomes. But broadly, what you should take away from this is that in physical systems, causes determine effects. So very broadly speaking, what makes a system, as I mentioned before, probabilistic rather than deterministic has to do with some exceptions in cause and effect, right? Most of them exist on a more microscopic level, but just to do them justice here, two main exceptions are the uncertainty principle, which has to do with our measurement of physical states and particles. So it seems that in some cases, even though cause and effect is true, we cannot know the precise values of certain particles so that they cannot perfectly be measured, basically. Their outcomes cannot be perfectly measured as a result. So neural signals are affected by uncertainty as well on the microscopic level. They have these wave-like properties, and so they're affected by electron activity and by the uncertainty that is sort of baked into the physical function of electrons. But this is on a very microscopic level. Another one is randomness. So randomness is another exception. Simply put, some micro phenomena are affected by randomness, so by chance. But it is important to note that randomness is not sort of at odds. It's not like opposite to causality. A random state can be the cause of a future outcome, if that makes any sense. So it's just that when randomness is present, physical relationships may be more probabilistic and impossible to predict with precision. And randomness is also thought to be involved in neural systems. So it would affect how deterministic the brain is, but sort of whether affected by a random or by an uncertain prior state, brain systems are still mostly thought to be deterministic, with prior neural states determining future neural states, even if it's sort of very hard to measure with prediction. Maybe an example that is more familiar to many people is the weather. So weather systems are a bit similar. They're largely deterministic. There are obviously random fluctuations and microscopic particles that act at random within weather, but weather is predictable, but not perfectly predictable, which is annoying, and we've all experienced that. And no matter how much the science of weather prediction has evolved, weather will likely never be completely predictable because there is some fluctuations with randomness, right? But we can still, on the whole, understand what's going to happen next and predict sort of major phenomena. So this year, scientists constructed the first full map of the fruit fly brain, which is one of those small steps that is groundbreaking. And it means that they can start working on constructing those different equations that are cause and effect that make up all of its behaviors now that they know the networks and every element that makes up the brain of a fruit fly. And if we knew all the equations involved in weather and could also take into account the randomness that's involved there, and if we knew all the equations that are involved in human behavior in the brain, solving them would mean predicting future behavior with near 100% accuracy. The problem is that right now it's impossible to know and compute all those different elements to fill in and solve this math. It's not that behavior is not predictable. In principle, it should be. It's that we will likely never get to the point where we know every single element. If it took us maybe 50 years to construct the fruit fly brain, it's possible we would no longer be around when we've managed to construct a full 100% accurate map of the human brain in order to start predicting what happens in those relationships. Right. So Physics generally shows us that everything in the physical world is part of a causal chain of events. And there's these bigger chains and then smaller chains within them. And the human biology and the human brain is one of those smaller chains within the larger sort of chain of events in the physical world. In thinking about criminal justice issues, one problem that arises is detecting or deciding which cause in a given chain we care about. So think about the example of Susie throwing a rock. So Susie throws a rock and she breaks a window, right? So you see there already a causal relationship. Susie throws a rock, it causes the window to break. Susie is guilty if we stop thinking about cause and effect at this arbitrary point. So if all we care about is what happens in the moment, which apparently the law does not care about, the law does go back to a certain extent in looking at what sort of promotes certain behaviors. But if we stop thinking about cause and effect at this moment, then yes, Susie is guilty. She threw the rock, it broke the window. But if we incorporate what we know about cause and effect, we may discover that, in fact, what compelled Susie was a traumatic upbringing or something in her experiences that caused her, let's say, bad parenting or a traumatic experience that caused her to engage in this behavior. Or it might be sort of a more external environmental factor in the moment. It could be that Susie's just fine otherwise and she would never throw her off, but she sees an intruder and she panics, and the first thing she thinks is throwing a rock at the intruder, and it also ends up breaking the window, right? So these are some steps back. And when you think about parenting, that's a lot of causal steps back in the past. When you think about seeing an intruder, that's only sort of a couple of steps removed as another cause to the effect of breaking the window. So the US criminal justice system is now punishing, for example, parents of school shooters, right? Because they are identified as the dominant cause, even if they are quite a few steps removed from the criminal outcome of a child going into the school and committing a shooting. So which causal factors are sort of considered here? Did the parents choose to be bad parents, or what did cause their behavior, right? So as far as of this year, the US criminal justice system is concerned, they go back a few steps and punish the parents. They could go further back, I suppose, and punish the grandparents, but that would be silly, maybe, at least in the way we understand morality today, that would be silly. But you do see that US law takes into account cause and effect relationships and goes to the extent of trying to select what is the dominant cause of something happening here, which is fundamentally a moral question, a philosophical question, and also a question about the laws of physics, about cause and effect. So selecting the dominant cause of an outcome is sort of this ongoing challenge, especially because when it comes to human biology, which is influenced by these countless internal and external causes, in the past and constantly in the present, we can never know all the potential causes relevant to the occurrence of an outcome. But the criminal justice system selects one dominant cause, and that can be your parents' behavior, that can be being confronted by an intruder, that can be stress in the present moment, right? Hopefully that makes sense so far. And if not, go back to what I said in the beginning and try to soak it in and know that in the future, you'll be better prepared to think about all these separate things if this doesn't make 100% sense right now. And hopefully, as I slowly try to bring this back to sort of criminal justice or intuitions about punishment, it will start sort of coming together. So, as I said, we cannot calculate human behavior with precision. But as we talked about, this does not mean that we cannot draw conclusions about the causal nature of biology and behavior. When we are dealing with simpler biological systems than the brain, we clearly see the rule of determinism. For example, we now can predict the development of certain diseases based on particular genetic traits. So we see the cause being the genes, the specific outcomes being specific diseases, and we can actually make those predictions with 100% accuracy because we're looking and working in smaller and simpler systems. And indeed, physics has shown that every biological outcome that we have thought to measure, basically, whether it's height, hair color, reflexes, cancer, other diseases, is necessitated by preceding events and conditions together sort of with the laws of nature. So our brains are basically built based on this physical law of causality. So science has never found any evidence of any other type of influence. That's not to say that other influences may not exist. But as far as at least brain biologists, we have not found an influence that doesn't sort of match causality, other than the ones I mentioned before, which are these tiny random fluctuations in atoms and in tiny, tiny particles. So what we have in terms of brain development is, well, first we have nothing, right? So there's just a sort of a potential. And then you have, in the development of the body, you have a zygote, and then you have cells, and these cells differentiate further. And then there's sort of all the organs and everything you have in your body. And that's how brains are made within sort of deterministic biological systems. One step causes the next, causes the next. And that's generally accepted knowledge. And in the brain, things get more complicated, but there's no reason why so far we would think that there's any other process involved there. So we think that brains are determined both by the genes that drive cell development and differentiation, and then specifically in the case of brains and some other organs surely as well, we also know that there are constant environmental influences. And I say other organs because, you know, the genes develop also lung development, and if you smoke, that's an external environmental influence that's going to further determine how your lungs develop and what happens to them, right? So the brain is no different than that. We know it's determined by genes that create cells that differentiate, and it's also constantly determined by environmental inputs. And in the case of the brain, it's a very plastic organ, so environmental influences have a massive input in how the brain is developed and how it continues through life to change and to rewire. So we know that genes and experiences are what sculpts the microstructure of the brain. So genes turn cells into a particular types of neurons. Our environments can influence the types of tasks, mostly the particular neurons take on, or which paths between neurons, for example, are easier to take and quicker to take, all these physiological variables. Then our brains can receive information, and based on this hardware, the easiest paths to take, right, this microstructure of the brain, habits, so on, our brains think and decide and create outputs. So outputs basically are entirely based on these existing neurons and networks. And if our outputs, if behavior is determined by acute, by sudden external factors, these are still funneled right through our perceptual system, through the brain. So it's entirely the brain that determines behavior. You can think about the brain as sort of one link in this causal chain that kind of determines everything that happens in the universe, right? Your behavior is just one link further. So a new state of your brain can be another link further. So because our brains are ever changing based on causes and effects, this means that while our behaviors are determined by our brains constantly change. And so our futures are not sort of bound by our innate biology. I mention this because a lot of the time at this point in the conversation, people get a little bit resistant to the idea or misinterpret this idea as meaning that everything is predetermined sort of at one point in time. When it comes to the human brain, that's not necessarily true because the brain is constantly determined. So new effects determine new causes, determine new effects, determine new causes. And so there's constant change. And so it's not to say that this outdated idea is true of genes determining how you are, right? Murderers are born and not caused. that's not necessarily true. Genes determine some very specific things in some specific cases that cannot be changed by the environment. But when it comes to the human brain, a lot of things, and not, if not most things, are subject to constant change because of environmental influences. So when we say that things are determined, we don't necessarily mean that they are predetermined at one moment in time and that's it. We're not talking about fate in that sense. Just about constant determinism, that every outcome is determined by the immediate state prior and everything that surrounds that specific causal chain. So here's a bad bear. This bad bear, I bring up at this point usually animal behavior because animal behavior is often violent and sort of reprehensible, but we seem to have good intuitions about animals being good or bad, even if they are violent, right? We have good intuitions about causality in the neurobiological systems of animals. So how do we think about the causes of animal behavior impacts our intuitions and moral judgments about this animal behavior? And most of us, even when we see an incident where a bear or a wild animal has done something reprehensible, we do not judge it in the same way that we judge humans doing something reprehensible. That's generally because we know that bears function based on their brains that are wired for survival and for violence, and they do not have sort of wiring for intellect and for ethics. And so when a bear attacks a mother and a child, like in this case in this article, that I have apparently picked off Instagram, but let's assume it's the website of the BBC News. So when a bear attacks a mother and a child and commits this terrible act, and we see that in the news that's presented in front of us, what we think about is avoiding future harm or preventing this to happen in the future, but we do not feel hate. We do not take revenge upon the bear. Apparently, we used to do this a few hundred years ago, but let's not get into that. When I first saw this article scrolling on my phone, it was more compassion for everybody involved that came to my mind, right? And I think for most people, they would not feel the same hate as if this picture was replaced by the picture of a person having done this, right? So in fact, if we would seem strange and silly to seek retribution, because it would be strange and silly to believe that a bear could have acted differently. A bear will do what a bear is wired to do, basically. And I bring this up because when it comes to human behavior, we, with our developed frontal lobes or our reasoning and planning and our empathetic superpowers that other animals do not have, we expect that we can do better. And most of us can do better, right? Most of us do not engage in the behaviors that wild animals engage in or that humans would have engaged in if they were, if they did stay in nature in the way that they were originally in nature as kind of wild animals. But the truth about humans is that because of this sort of, there is a wiring in us, right, that comes from our ancestry of being wild. And so not all brains are shaped in the same way, and not all brains have the same sort of propensity for being more, let's call it domesticated rather than wild. And we see that in animals too. We see it in our pets. Some pets are wilder. I have two cats. One of them wild. She could probably survive in the wild. The other one, non-wild, wouldn't last a day. She's more empathetic. She's wired differently, even though they're the same species, right? So importantly, we have sort of a major bias in understanding and assessing behavior because we feel that we are in control as agents. We don't feel that cats or wild animals are necessarily in control of their behaviors, just that they're driven by their primitive brains. But we have this bias because we feel in control. We feel that we are agents and we make the decision to do the right thing or the wrong thing. So we blame ourselves too, right, when we choose to do the wrong thing. And we have this sort of illusion of control. And so we expect others to do the same. And of course, it's impossible to take into consideration the different wiring of their brains and the different things they would do based on that. There we go. So what we forget is that what really causes behavior is not sort of an executive decision at the very moment of action. A moment, there is no sort of clear moment where you can say, I'm going to choose right for wrong from wrong right now, despite everything else. But rather, it's sort of a causal chain of events that is very powerful in determining behavioral outcomes. Scientific research shows us that our behavior is on average predictable based on factors such as genes, life experiences, neurochemicals. But what we do end up thinking is that we, unlike other animals, are rational. And so, how come we do bad things? If we know that something is morally correct, why can we just not just choose to do the right thing, right? And I know most of us probably haven't committed a murder, but we do things that we don't want to be doing and we know are bad for us all the time. And in those moments, it's if you really pay attention, it's almost impossible to tell what drives that, right? If you wanted to not eat that cupcake and you do anyway, it's something that you don't even want to be doing. You know it's wrong based on your values in that moment about what you want to be eating, and yet you cave and do it anything. So you see there is sort of, in that moment there's a causal change of events that leads you to have this, craving for sugar, and you understand that comes from like a deeper place in the brain. But we have these intuitions that can be more judgmental, I suppose, when it comes to behaviors that are more planned or have to do with empathy or have to do with other people. So, sort of what we do end up thinking is exactly that we should know better, and that we should do the right thing despite our predispositions or weaknesses. Um, what we so I guess by now you can guess that I believe that the answer is that we cannot necessarily do otherwise. Just as many of us have tried for years and years to cut a bad habit or to not, let temptation take over about any number of things in our lives, the way I understand that type of causal chain in the broader sense of biology and behavior leads me to believe that we cannot necessarily take the wheel and be those agents that sort of drive our behavior moment to moment, because basically there is no wheel, right? There is no agent, there is no driver's seat. Our behaviors are outputs that are created by just a series of parallel processes that succumb to the laws of physics. So there is no driver's seat that we can sit in and say, despite all of this machinery that's going on in the background, I'm going to choose to do A or B. That eye is lacking, and that wheel, that driver's seat is lacking, and we haven't found something like that in the human brain. So in behavioral psychology, when we talk about agents, so I as an agent in the driver's seat, agents are these goal-directed entities that are able to monitor the environment and to sort of select things and perform actions. And we are that, right? We are agents in that sense. We navigate and take inputs and produce outputs. But the agent then is still a collection of physical properties that are determined by our brains, that are determined by prior causes. And in this sense, bears are agents too, right? And like us, they may also have a sense of a unitary self, a driver, because this helps with many social functions. They navigate the world, they create these little shortcuts, they help us along. And sort of in this case, we unfortunately tend to mistakenly think of that agent that navigates the world as a self that can overwrite their biology or their wiring of their brain. And as in the case of the bear, basically, as in the case of all animals, humans too, the brain is sort of thought of as a consultant, and which is sort of a false perception of how the brain determines behavior. We think about us as being able to choose behaviors based on the brain consulting us what to do. But in reality, the brain just produces outputs, and we're merely there observing them. And we see that and believe that in the case of a bear attacking a person, that its brain is propelling it with no ill intent. But we tend to forget that when it comes to humans, it is the same process. Brains through this very complex parallel processing, a lot of it happening under the hood, create outputs. And there isn't really one moment where we can jump in and say, I'm going to ignore all of this advice the brain is giving me and just do the right thing. And if we do that in some cases, that's just the brain output, basically. So it matters that we think sort of scientifically about this idea of choice and control. So if you let's run an experiment, right? You can think about take a moment and think about a city, just any city. Just try to search your mind. You can pick a city you like. Just as free as a decision that you can make. You can pick a city you don't like. You can pick the city you're born in. Whatever. Just pick a city. If you pay attention to this process of making this decision, so thinking, processing, being aware of your final answer, does that feel like a free choice? This is pretty much as free a choice as you will ever make, basically, just randomly picking a city, no strings attached, right? It may have felt like a free choice. Our brains try hard to give us this sense of agency that I just talked about. But if you examine in your memory the decision being made, how much choice was there? And did you choose the criteria upon which you based that choice? So if you selected the name of a city that you were born in, you didn't select the city you were born in, so that's not really a free choice. You were just born there. If you selected a city that you like, sure, that you're free to select the city that you like, but you don't really pick the criteria on which you decided you like that city. Maybe you like busy places, maybe you like less busy places. That's not really your choice. So in that sense, if you look at a few steps back in that causal chain, you start seeing that even though something may feel like a free choice in the present moment, it's not exactly a free choice if you take into account everything that shaped it. And if you examine your memory and sort of the decision being made, do you see that you could have picked the name of a city, for example, that you didn't know? And I looked this up to find a city that that most people wouldn't know. There's a city called Placentia in California. If anybody's from there, shout out to Placentia. But most people wouldn't know this name, right? So you wouldn't choose Placentia because you never heard of it before. So again, there is a lack of freedom in that. I'm going to try to bring it all the way back to criminal justice later, and you'll see that you cannot choose a behavior that you never learned. You cannot choose peace over violence if you were taught violence your whole life, and you cannot choose Placentia over New York if you never heard about Placentia, right? And let's say you picked your favorite city, again, your hometown, as I said before, you didn't exactly decide your birth town or what you find cool versus uncool, right? So it is basically the brain that creates all these conditions that create this decision in the moment. And if you imagine a more complex decision, how you react under uncertainty or under threat, even more so, could you choose something that didn't occur to you to choose, or an appropriate response that you never learned, or conflict resolution when you never learned conflict resolution? There are so many experiments that scientists have ran along these lines, right? From the simpler pick a city to much more complex responses to threatening social situations. And they show us again and again that causality and determinism are directly involved in human behavior rather than agency and choice. And so our current understanding is that decisions, behavioral outputs are generally computed subconsciously and observed or further processed consciously to a lesser extent. And they are caused by prior states of the brain and the environment, which in turns are caused by states prior than those, which are also in turn caused by states prior to those, and so on and so forth. And that's what we've seen with sort of very physiological experiments with EEG, looking at moment to moment reactions and decisions, but also looking at life course development and the types of cognitive and functional deficits that people exhibit after having undergone certain life experiences or having certain genetic variations, and those sorts of things. I list here a few studies in case you're interested in looking at more concrete evidence on this. The problem with sort of drawing a very distinct line in this is that it's the many, many studies when looked at together that lead us to this conclusion that behavior is sort of determined by biological systems and not really by active choice. There's not going to be a one study that's going to show you that, but it's going to be your understanding of the whole field. And that's why I am tiring you on a Sunday with a lot of this information, because it's the bulk of information that can convince you and help you understand what drives behavior, not just one study or one fact, right? And as I said earlier, it's hard for all of it to be taken in at once, but the more you read these studies and these ideas, the more it sort of starts coming together, hopefully. So understanding how choices are made is very important, of course, in evaluating these choices. I mentioned at the very beginning how the criminal justice system looks at the choice to commit an act through a particular lens of a mental state, right? So understanding the way we make choices is, and the reason we make choices is central to the evaluation of these choices. And that's what the basically criminal legal system does. We talked about this sort of at the start with legal responsibility, which, as a refresher, determines whether somebody is guilty or not. Then we start looking at how sort of morally reprehensible the act was, how much do we want to deter these kind of behaviors, how much we consider a defendant to have been at liberty not to engage in the act based on moment-to-moment things, and so on. So we looked at aggravating factors, we look at mitigating factors to determine sort of the level of responsibility beyond like the yes or no of somebody is being guilty. So based on all of these moral factors, basically, we decide about blameworthiness, the moral responsibility of the person. So on one hand, we have legal responsibility. Is the person guilty? And we have, did they commit a guilty act? We have the 4 criteria we talked about. Those are binary. They're yes or no answers, right? Once you determine guilt, you look at the moral responsibility. You look at how guilty somebody is. And I'm sure you can think of many examples on that, where we think about somebody as being more or less morally responsible based on the circumstances that led them to commit an act. Retributive attitudes are linked to the perception of a person really choosing to do harm. So in the worst of cases, when somebody is guilty and we consider them to be fully morally responsible, we apply retribution because of how reprehensible basically the behavior as a overall case is. As long as we believe that bad behavior is a free choice, at least in some cases, vengeance and retribution makes sense. If we think that somebody really chooses to do something when they could have just not done it, chosen to kill someone, right? Or when they could have chosen not to do it, that's when it makes sense to feel hate and vengeance and want to have this retributive attitude towards them. We saw this earlier when I showed you our study that we conducted with judges, where we asked judges where those that believe in determinism kind of cannot justify almost retribution. And that's how they talked about it as well, that if they believe that that behavior is always caused by prior states, brain states, external states, they're like, retribution doesn't make sense. And I kind of almost exclude that factor. That's how they talk about it. They talk about this idea that an eye for an eye doesn't really make sense. And they do not think that the criminal justice system should be inflicting harm upon people that break the law in order to, restore some moral balance in society. Because exactly they believe that people aren't bad just to be bad, basically. So ultimately, understanding causality leads these judges to have more empathy towards people and the reasons why they do what they do. Yeah, so the law does recognize, aside from on individual judges do, which they have a lot of discretion to do in the US system, the law specifically also does recognize the obvious cases in which human behavior is caused and not chosen, right? One example is the case of Charles Whitman, which many of you may know from older news reports. This is an obvious example. In 1966, Charles Whitman shot and killed 15 people at the University of Texas. And then he was immediately, I think, on the scene, killed by police. His autopsy revealed a brain tumor about the size of a walnut, pressing onto his amygdala. Walnut-sized tumor is not the most massive one you've ever heard about, but pressing on the amygdala does sound catastrophic. So this was sort of connected with some probable childhood trauma that he may have had. And the war also talks about sort of this string of behaviors in the months leading up to the attack and some environmental factors. But of course, nobody could disregard the fact that this man had a tumor pressing on the area of the brain that controls anger and fear and threat responses, right? So public perceptions of Whitman are directly tied to this condition. Why? Because the cause of the sort of tragic effect was obvious and it was visible. So I'm sure some people that really are not fond of thinking in scientific terms about human behavior would have been able to disregard the tumor. But I think most people, and the way this case has gone down in history, has been as an example case of what happens when our biology betrays us and directly leads us to do bad things. So a brain tumor is the most obvious case of causal neurophysiology, but in any brain state, once traced to its causes, you could have this being as exculpatory as a brain tumor, right? So there are other cases where the law now recognizes that children, teenagers, some severe brain disorders that are very provable, like a brain tumor, like schizophrenia, types of psychosis, that these really cause bad behaviors and should be treated differently at the sentencing stage. So having a severe mental disorder or being a teenager will be, at this point in time, massively mitigating to the extent to which we hold a person morally responsible. So what does it mean in the context of sentencing and the law that people that have these mitigating factors are treated differently? So first, as I mentioned before, retribution is removed. And you can say this from the perspective I come from the neuroscience perspective or from a philosophical perspective. But again, I've heard many judges say that from their sort of legal perspective, as we talked about, it's not reasonable to seek revenge from an actor that we consider not to have fully and freely chosen or controlled their behavior, or that they weren't able to do so. And so we don't want a teenager that did something bad to suffer because of doing something bad, right? At least in theory, the law does not seek retribution from teenagers or from people with severe mental disorders or from somebody with a brain tumor. But punishment is still relevant in those cases because there are other goals we seek to achieve through punishment. It's the same as, your parents punishing you when you were a kid, right? It's not about retribution. It's not about hate. It's just about achieving change, basically positive change. So in some cases, even if we fully grasp that behavior is a causal outcome of biology, we may still want to incapacitate the person to stop them from harming others physically if they cannot help themselves. And we definitely want to rehabilitate them if possible. And that all comes through punishment. Of course, I think many of us would like to see punishment in the criminal justice system being done better. But as a concept, punishment still has a role in society, even if we accept that we're not in control of the behaviors that we exhibit. And so when we think about punishment in this sense, we see punishment as another cause in this causal chain, right? It becomes Punishment becomes this experience that we previously mentioned causes new brain states. So we inserted a punishment in the causal change, and especially because behavior is determined, punishment plays this crucial role in rewiring and reshaping the structure of the brain, leading to better future outcomes. So another sort of breaking point in these conversations is when people say, well, you can say that people are not in control you want, but we can't have murderers roaming free. And I completely agree. Nobody, just as we do with small children, nobody says that there is no space for a criminal justice system, for a system of law, for a system of punishment. Behavior being determined means that punishment is necessary, but it's necessary as a cause and effect relationship with behavior, not as a means of exerting vengeance and revenge upon people because we think they're bad, basically. And so when we understand behavior as caused by brain states and we understand behavior as deterministic, what is removed is personal blame, basically vengeance, but not responsibility. And so there are many cases in which individuals with severe mental illnesses, for example, or psychosis, are considered not to author their own thoughts and reactions. And again, in those cases, mitigation is rooted in this idea of physical causality and biological relationship. I mentioned some case law cases here that are super interesting, and we don't have the time to go into in detail, but feel free to look into them and think about what we talked about today in terms of physical causality, and notice how the law, even though it doesn't explicitly obviously mention physics or sometimes even brain biology, it does take into account causality. It does look at how physical causality and determinism are at the center of some brain states causing a behavioral outcome, whether it's childhood and teenage brains or a psychotic disorder or anything else that clearly determines behavior. So what comes next is moving this arbitrary line sort of to remove blame, not only from the most severe and obvious cases, but from our understanding of all human behavior. What I hopefully reminded you of today is that our neurobiological systems are governed by the laws of physics, including causality. And I hope to have started you thinking about the causal chain of facts, events, brains, behaviors, and whether this causal chain is compatible with the idea that individuals can choose to be good despite the genes and the environmental influences that they have no choice over, right? So to close off with, the criminal justice responses to crime will not fundamentally change by understanding behavior as deterministic, but sort of as legal scholars have concluded and scientists have concluded, criminal responsibility will remain sort of this practical concept, and punishment can be seen as an educational objective. So if you do start thinking about our behaviors as being determined by prior brain states, you don't need to worry about that meaning that we will have so much empathy for everyone, that we will have murderers roam the streets freely, right? We still see sort of a purpose for stopping people from harming others and rehabilitating people in this cause and effect type of relationship that our brains engage in. So yeah, so one thing I wanted to close off with today was a judge that I chatted with last summer that said, people are not just bad for the sake of being bad. And the way she said it was also, as I said at the very beginning of this lecture, this very intuitive thing that almost sounds silly to say. People are not bad just for being bad. Anyone that's been in my courts, he said, would never have chosen to be back here in front of me. And she was talking about recidivism. She was saying, if you're here, you're unlucky. If you're back in front of me in the future, you definitely didn't make that choice. And I thought that was quite powerful. And judges are not scientists, but they do run their own behavioral experiments as they see so many people in front of them. And they can be very wise when it comes to human behavior. And I think they've drawn in many cases, these intuitive understandings of causal relationships and lack of control over behavior. So yeah, that's all for me. Hopefully not too much for a Sunday. And yeah, thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Mia. That was absolutely incredible. If everyone could join me in a digital round of applause. That was wonderful. And I really appreciate you also highlighting how we really bring together individuals from such different backgrounds. I mean, judges, for instance, who may have not really been in conversation as much with neuroscientists 10, 20 years in the past. But now we are building out those relationships and seeing how there's bidirectional inspiration going on. So it's really wonderful to hear about those intersections. And thanks for sharing the contact info too. I was about to ask about the email. So
Yeah,
there it is on the
awesome.
screen, folks.
Okay, let me just stop sharing. And yeah, thanks very much for having me, Chinmay.
Of course, Mia. Thank you. Appreciate your time on the weekend, especially coming back after travel and all.
Not at all. I enjoyed this very much. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I will let you go to enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I guess I'll see you this week later. Wonderful. Well, folks, again, if you have any questions for Mia, please feel free to reach out, email, LinkedIn website, and the chat as well. Why don't we take a very brief 1-2 minute break and then we will transition over.